good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ed Barton. I'm an analyst in the media entertainment team at Ovum. I've got a number of things I thought I'd share with you today, largely around a lot of the M&A that we're currently seeing in the entertainment industry. Excuse me, I always set myself a timer when I speak so I don't overrun.
There's one down there, Ed.
That's absolutely correct. Thanks very much. So my role at Ovum largely consists of working with leadership teams around some of the most difficult strategic problems. Naturally, many of these companies are heavily invested in the future of the media and entertainment business, specifically regarding the future of visual entertainment distribution. So I've put together some material today that we've used with some of our clients that we share with all of our clients, obviously. But these effectively became a research stream in and of themselves over the last couple of years. And the number of times we get asked things, particularly around competing with the scale digital platforms. And so what's going to happen when AT&T and Time Warner finally come together? What's going to happen with Disney? What's going to happen with Fox? What's going to happen with Comcast? And now that we have some sense of what is going to happen with these organizations, particularly around the M&A, we spend a lot of time at Ovum looking ahead and thinking, so what does that actually mean the entertainment industry is going to look like in the years leading up to 2022? What impact will it have on some of the runaway growth stories that we've witnessed over the last decade or so in TV and video? And so I thought I'd share with you some thoughts around that area. I've called it supersizing because I truly believe that the current round of M&A is going to result in a number of companies who have a scale the likes of which we've never seen before, certainly with a level of influence and power across both content creation and distribution, which I don't believe we've seen in the past. So a very interesting time to be an analyst. So where do we start with today? When we think about the current competitive situation, when we think about how the industries that we're talking about are currently progressing, the prevailing narrative in TV and video is relatively gloomy at the moment. Millennials will never subscribe to pay TV. Viewing time on the types of TV we've been making the most money of for the last few decades is stagnant or even in secular decline in some markets. There are growth stories, of course. I think two of the growth stories that we'll think about a little bit during the session will be ad-supported online video and, of course, OTT subscription video services. But there are some problems with those growth stories as well, in that the growth across pretty much all of the markets we look at for those particular growth stories, and I think we look at about 200 at the moment, growth obviously tends to be dominated by one or two or perhaps three scaled, multinational digital platforms who are frankly an awesome competitive force to deal with in the marketplace. Pay TV in the USA is in secular decline. We do know that there are many pockets of growth opportunity further afield, particularly in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, where pay TV penetration is much, much lower. We're extremely interested in what pay TV companies are doing to try to compete more effectively with the twin threats of, we would argue, just to paraphrase, although there are local alternatives, YouTube and Netflix, who are fantastic at taking up large amounts of viewing time, but this viewing time is not monetized as effectively as their counterparts on the traditional side of the equation, who obviously use pay TV subscriptions and commercial broadcast. When we think about commercial broadcast itself, we see a largely stagnant global picture. TV advertising is a relatively cyclical industry, tends to march in lockstep with FMCG spending and the growth of the FMCG sector in a given market overall. TV advertising has obviously got its own struggles with digital advertising. In fact, we would have framed that initially as a gigantic opportunity to take the commercial broadcast model into the digital sphere. I think we would argue that the impacts of tube sites in particular have very much mitigated against this possibility. We do see terrestrial broadcaster catch-up services. We see some new initiatives regarding alliances between broadcasters, which we'll think a little bit more about as we go on. But in general, the price of online video advertising is relatively low, and we certainly see some efforts in the marketplace by a number of broadcasters to try to carve out a slightly different strata, where they're saying, look, our shows, we're showing them to you maybe new, exclusively, we're showing them to you straight after we broadcast them. These are 30 to 40 minutes, high production values. These deserve a higher level of media spend than the short-form content, which tends to dominate this medium. OTT subscriptions has been perhaps one of the most revolutionary impacts on how we spend money on entertainment over the last 10 years or so. Earlier in the day, we hear about how it was only 11 years ago when Netflix popped up, and in doing so has had a fantastically, I would also argue, positive competitive impact on the rest of the television and video industry. And in fact, many of the changes, many of the transactions that we're currently seeing, we would argue are a direct result of the fantastic service and product proposition that Netflix and similar organizations have brought to the marketplace. In digital video advertising, which we've touched on a little bit already, again, we see growth, but we've kept the vertical axes for each of these charts consistent, just so you can see the relative level of revenue generation across each of the different types. As you can probably quite easily see, looking at digital advertising across the TV, video advertising, looking at OTT subscriptions across pay TV subscriptions, the bulk of the spending is occurring in the traditional sphere. The growth is in the online sphere, but most of that growth is accruing to a handful of organizations not invested in this side of the slides. It's a very interesting dilemma that many of these organizations have to deal with. Thinking a little bit more in more depth about some of the digital competition that I was telling you about, we look at this, I think, over about 100 markets across OTT subscriptions and OTT ad-supported video. And I also think it's an interesting strand of our research because for many years we spent a lot of time and effort. How big is the industry in the UK? How big is the pay TV subscription industry? How big is the commercial broadcast industry? But the attention we gave to specific service providers or companies within that mix was, I would argue, limited. Over the last couple of years, across our entertainment practice, one of the big efforts we've been making is to transcend the country and the industry segmentations and drill down to a company or a service provider level. Obviously, this gives us a lot of interesting fun and games to be had around thinking about market shares, forecasting those into the future. A pretty fractious game in an industry this dynamic. But anyway, our clients pay us to take a position on these questions. They say, what does Ovum think? What do you think is going to happen over the next few years? And so we've been putting a lot more effort into trying to work out. So in online video subscriptions, yeah, sure, the whole thing is growing. But how much of the growth in subscription revenues accrues to companies who aren't called Amazon or Netflix? What we have in these two charts is the gray portion of the bar is YouTube and Facebook on the right and Amazon and Netflix on the left. The red portion of the bar is the amount of revenue left accruing to all of the other competitors in that particular industry. So, and the line along the top denotes what the revenue market share is of Amazon and Netflix in that market. OTT subscriptions on this side and OTT ad-supported video on the left-hand side. We've decided to look at the US and the UK in these particular examples, but this competitive situation is largely replicated throughout the world with only small variations. Effectively, we're looking at up to 75% market share for the scale digital platforms in the main growth narratives for TV and video, leaving, of course, a relatively small piece of the pie for a relatively large number of companies to compete with. This obviously a cause for celebration for the scale digital platforms who, as we know, continue to execute fantastically and do a great job. But when we think about all of the, say, OTT subscription services which have been launching over the last 2 to 3 years, and they've been launching at a furious rate, then it does give us some cause for concern for the viability, the growth prospects of many of the companies who aren't called Amazon or Netflix or YouTube or the like. We've always known that being an online video subscription service and trying to compete against Netflix is extremely challenging, to say the least. We've long held to the idea that if you are a standalone video subscription service and you are trying to sell yourselves head-to-head against one of the other subscription services, then everyone thinks about the hockey stick growth of the entire sector, whereas actually most OTT video subscription services are struggling. And we believe a shakeout has started, which will continue over the next 12 to 18 months. And that will be a direct result of, firstly, some of the challenges of operating in this marketplace, a sharpening of competition from, I'll paraphrase and call them FANGs, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. And also a result of sharpening competition from some of the supersized companies that we see emerging. There's another interesting kind of mobile strand to much of what we're talking about as well. And actually, I mean, we're looking at online here, but I am aware that when we run the same analysis on our AVOD marketing share, then when we go to mobile, then the market share of the scale digital giants actually increases. So if much of the growth in viewing is going to be on mobile devices, which we fully subscribe to, particularly with the transition towards 5G-capable cellular networks, which we'll think about in a little bit as well, then again, this certainly potentially poses some existential challenges going forward. So the response to this has been perhaps the most exciting wave of M&A activity, certainly in entertainment industry history. So I mentioned that we look at companies on a service level basis much more closely than we ever did before. A number of our clients, they would ask us, so what happens if AT&T and Time Warner come out the gates? What happens if Comcast and Sky get together? We're pretty sure that Disney and Fox have got it going on, and that particular combination is more or less confirmed. We should be hearing a lot more about Sky tomorrow with the latest thinking that there will be a blind auction administered by the Competition Commission to determine the fate of Sky. But I think one of the exercises I thought I'd share with you today is where we looked at a future where, okay, Comcast and Sky is a thing, Disney, Fox is a thing, AT and Warner is a thing. How does that shake out? What does that look like in relation to some of the other companies which we look at as well? In particular, the scaled multinational digital platforms. So when we looked at we took a look at their 2017 data, and then we thought, so how much direct revenue from TV and video are these organizations actually making? And of course, this, as you might imagine, involves pulling together a lot of data around commercial broadcast, carriage fees, pay TV subscriptions, OTT subscriptions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, let's look at them through the same lens and see if we can come up with anything interesting. When we think about the mergers and the M&A activity currently going on, we see it as an explicit response to the existential competitive threat presented by the scaled multinational digital platforms. The thesis driving these combinations is, I think, driven by a number of factors. We'll look at a few of those closely in the slides to come. But predominantly, and this has been going, going back to AOL Time Warner, the argument that if you're going to succeed in media, you need to be big has been going on. The scale argument certainly persists into this generation. Of course, if you're a larger organization, you also have a larger pool of spending to invest in content, which is becoming extremely important. If you're a larger organization, if you have more outlets, the likelihood is that by combining, you'll give yourself access to a larger total audience. If you have a larger total audience, You have a larger audience from which to gather data, which seems to be is an area of potential which a lot of TV and video companies are extremely excited about. Larger audience, more data gathering. The larger audience enables finer segmentation as well. So if you do develop the infrastructure to target advertising, in particular based on that data, then you can basically do a better job of it. It's also worth remembering that many of the arguments put forward by these organizations for combining are untested hypotheses. We don't know if they're going to work, which is why the next few years, I think, promise to be extremely interesting indeed. I mean, some of the logic is very compelling. AT&T are extremely clear, and they're very positive about their positioning now that they own Time Warner, now that they own DirecTV. They think to themselves, okay, so we've got the DirecTV audience through the set-top box. We have the HBO Now audience online, and we have the AT&T Watch and AT&T Watch pay TV audience on mobile, AT&T Watch being an explicitly mobile-oriented pay TV service, although it's bundled with the AT&T mobile subscription. But the idea being, they have a TV audience, an online audience, and a mobile audience. They can go to a big campaign advertiser, big brand advertiser, and they can say, for one single campaign buy, we can run your campaign across TV, online, and digital. We can eliminate wastage. We can do all of these things that you've been moaning about for years, but we made you buy separate campaigns on TV and online. We can do single dashboard analytics. We can evaluate the campaign in the same way across all of the mediums. The multi-platform single buy ad campaign being another thing, generating some amount of excitement in our view. And of course, that targeted style of advertising is only enabled by capturing a lot of data on your audience and having access to that audience over all of the platforms and the ability to target ads to each of them. In terms of the competitive situation, what it looks like before and after the combinations, I mean, we see that essentially half a dozen organizations which are spread across the top 8 or 9 of our notional global leading video platforms immediately pretty much double in size in terms of their direct TV and video revenues and all go to the top of the table. Not hugely surprisingly, because of course we have significant pay TV revenues in there as well. But it's going to be a very interesting period in actually determining whether many of the promises made by the supersized organizations and their ambitions for success, if they're going to be realized or not. I mentioned that one other thing that combining does is that it gives an organization a greater pool of money to spend on either producing your own or acquiring other people's content. Again, so I put 2017, before we merge at the top, 2017 content spend after we merge at the bottom. I think this might cause confusion to some people perhaps in the audience who don't follow this to the kind of nerd level we do, and there's absolutely no reason you should. There are absolutely better things for your time, I'm sure. However, a lot of the narrative tends to be around the spending power, in particular of a couple of the leading OTT subscription platforms. And so just it's worth noting that the huge amounts more that the traditional media and entertainment companies are spending on content also includes sport. The analysis we see in newspapers, etc., almost always takes live sport rights, licensing costs out of the equation. I mean, from the looks of things, with the supersized organizations, I mean, it really looks like they should just be eating Netflix and Amazon's lunch tomorrow, purely on the basis of the vastly higher level of spending that they can bring to bear on their content. But of course, it's also worth remembering that Netflix and Amazon basically only have to feed one particular targeted platform. If you think about the dozens, perhaps hundreds of channel outlets, of OTT streaming services, pay channels, even theatrical, that the organizations also have to feed with that particular content spend, I don't think it's so clear. One thing which we do expect to happen as a result of these combinations is that is that more of the spending will be focused on fewer of the platforms, particularly from the supersized organizations. So, one example I think would be, that's name-checked a lot, would be HBO Now, owned by Time Warner, one of the most recognizable channel brands in the world. I think HBO spent somewhere between $1.5 to $2 billion last year making its own shows. And AT&T have been AT&T Media, as I believe it's been rebadged, they've been quite explicit. They've said, okay, we're happy to multiply this investment 2, 3, 4 times over the years because we want you to get as big as Netflix, essentially. You're not going to get as big as Netflix by spreading your bets across some fragmented and not highly recognizable platforms. If you're going after Netflix, it's got to be a global brand, and you've got to go big on content. And that's exactly what we expect to see HBO Now do over the next few years. I also thought it'd be interesting just to put into a little bit of context how we view the direct-to-consumer model in relation to all of the other ways of making money from TV and video, which we might be more familiar with. There's been a huge amount of discussion about we shouldn't be working with distributors so much. Okay, so we own some channels, but we have to work with pay TV operator X, and they pay us, and we don't actually know the names or addresses or more significantly, we don't get access to any of the data generated by the viewing habits of these customers that the pay TV distributor brings to us. This is a problem. How do we address this? So, of course, over the last few years, I would argue crescendoing in the last sort of 12 months or so, we've seen a huge amount of discussion of, okay, we're going to go direct to consumer. Let's cut out the middleman. And, let's get to know our customers ourselves. Let us expose ourselves to that river of data on which we're all basically betting our futures. When we think about direct-to-consumer platforms, I think the things that we're very excited by, so obviously Netflix and YouTube we would classify as direct-to-consumer platforms. Traditional pay TV subscriptions themselves fall into the same bracket. Of course, you're dealing directly with the end user. When we think about them going forward, then we're looking at the top part of the slide. So we've kind of put the traditional ones in the bottom half. And as I hope is sort of clear from some of the earlier slides, in no way are we suggesting that there's going to be any suggestion from the companies we work with anyway that pay TV or home entertainment, the disc sales business, deeply unsexy and legacy, or even good old cinema going, that there will be any less emphasis placed on these particular outlets. And obviously such was the difference in revenue generation. It is incumbent on them to defend this as much as possible, all at the same time, if they're good at executing, disrupting themselves by investing heavily in, frankly, services which impact the value proposition of the types of service at the bottom. When we think about some of the direct-to-consumer initiatives that we're quite excited about, HBO Now, we've already talked about a little bit. We've also seen some very interesting initiatives from sports rights owners, F1 TV, WWE Network. There are a couple of fantastic case studies in how to lessen your reliance on pay TV and how to use direct-to-consumer to build audiences in countries where traditional TV partners and commercial broadcast or pay TV might not be being as successful as you suspect you could be in that particular country. I think perhaps the most definitive pivot towards direct-to-consumer is probably from the Disney Corporation, one of the most storied names in entertainment, of course. But the strategic process that Disney has gone through over the last few years has essentially ended up with them committing heavily to the direct-to-consumer model. Over 2019, we can expect to see the release, I think, of the launch of multiple Disney-badged OTT subscription services, largely organized by the IPs that they're distributing. So it's likely that there'll be, I believe, a Marvel service, a Disney Kids service, and perhaps an alternate service for some of the more sort of indie-oriented cinema that Disney's involved with. But the direction of travel is clear. We don't want to rely on Comcast. We don't want to rely on DirecTV. We don't want to rely on Sky. We've built a business empire worth hundreds of billions of dollars over the last few decades through that. But the future is in direct-to-consumer. This is a pretty ballsy pivot to make, and certainly one, we think, which brings with it many fascinating but quite fundamental execution challenges as well. If we think, we have some familiarity with Netflix's growth, its scale at the moment, which for a number of reasons is quite likely to be unique in business history. If you think, it took Netflix 11 years of practically inventing the format, enjoying some fantastic growth to get to the scale and the coverage that it has now. Disney starts from naught next year and has, not quite naught, they do have Disney Life SVOD service, which was a kind of a dress rehearsal for the direct-to-consumer side. But Disney starts with a user base of less than 1 million subscribers next year. And what is it putting at risk? Well, Disney's entire current business is based on things like, is based on ownership of a number of channels which are heavily invested in the growth of pay TV, particularly US pay TV. When Disney makes a movie which does very well, like Black Panther, about 6 to 7 weeks after its theatrical release, Disney will probably clear somewhere between $150 to $200 million on downstream revenues after theatrical, home entertainment, licensing to SVOD, wholesale distribution to channels around the world. This is a lot of money to put on the line. If we think about how much Disney makes from wholesaling its TV shows to non-Disney-owned channels every year, this is somewhere in the region of $1.5 to $2 billion. These are all revenues being put at risk by going direct to consumer, and would certainly indicate that for a good few years, Disney will effectively have to straddle both spheres in order to keep its shareholders happy. So we thought a little bit about content spend. We thought a little bit about the revenues generated by these combinations. I also thought we might think about, how many subscribers? Let's be hippie-ish and kind of think, just any type of subscriber, OTT and TV. How does that reshape things? The sad truth is, when we look at this, again, we've done a similar thing, 2017 data before and after supersizing. The gray bits of the column are TV subscribers. The red bits are OTT subscribers, where we're all extremely excited about the growth prospects going forward. So, to be honest, this is probably one of the more discouraging charts in that even by combining, they don't get anywhere close to Netflix, which we would regard, I think, as almost a unique entity operating in a scale and stratosphere which is unmatched by any other organization. This is important because if we think about it in terms of content investment, Netflix is effectively enabled to spend a huge amount of content because of its huge subscriber base. And obviously, the larger the subscriber base, the lower your content costs on a per subscriber basis. And another argument for aggregating and scaling up. So I think this does pose some interesting questions as to how much some of the current transactions will actually change. Certainly, if there is going to be some evolution or some significant change from what we're experiencing now, then the way that these combined entities compete against the digital platforms will also have to evolve significantly and perhaps bring to the party some competitive strategies which we've yet to see. I mentioned that we'd touch a little bit on an area. I've been an analyst for 20 years. I don't think I've ever seen a single topic actually touch so many different parts of an analyst firm's themes and topic areas as comprehensively as 5G has with my current employer. Pretty much every discussion we're having these days, in fact, just about the past year as well, has involved some variant of the question. So how is 5G going to affect what we're doing now? We're very fortunate to have been engaged to do some pretty deep dive consulting on some of the opportunities in media and entertainment in particular. Start really thinking about some of the use cases enabled by the early deployments of 5G. When we're thinking about this in terms of TV and video, I think we're excited about a number of things. We're particularly excited about the impact that it's going to have on 5G network operators and the enthusiasm we detect from these companies to be very aggressive with their 5G subscriptions in bundling all types of OTT entertainment, not just TV and video, with 5G connectivity. 5G connectivity is being promoted by Verizon very, very strongly as a replacement for residential broadband. In this particular deal, if you sign up, you get either your choice of a free Chromecast or a free Apple TV set-top box, and you get 3 months access to YouTube TV, which is YouTube's subscription-based pay TV online streaming service, if you're not familiar with it, sometimes referred to as a skinny bundle. There are also a host of use cases. So, on the one hand, enabling today's usage patterns over mobile more effectively. On the other hand, we're also firmly confident that it potentially gives rise to a number of very interesting innovations and use cases around video streaming, around the TV experience, that we hope, but don't know, will drive the market significantly. And obviously, when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about some of the interesting possibilities around VR and AR in particular, and some of the bandwidth requirements for holographic displays. So, just to kind of round things off, I think we'll be cool to take a question or two, or. Okay, cool. In which case, I'll wrap up really quickly. Okay, great. So what does this all mean? How is it going to shake out? So we already talked, 5G is going to change everything. We're not quite sure how, but it's going to be pretty positive on the most part. Live sport, which we've only sort of touched on tangentially, and absolutely, I often think live sport, the importance of it is actually underplayed slightly in the sort of prevailing press narrative around how TV and video are changing. Live sport is the final bedrock of high ARPU pay TV, we'd argue. If that goes from pay TV, it will be as a result of some pretty cataclysmic changes. We'll probably rip up most of the slides you've seen today. But we know that digital giants, Twitter and Amazon in particular, Facebook as well, are getting increasingly aggressive about bidding for sports rights. They've been winning some of those auctions. They're currently experimenting, and they're here to stay. We also know that some sports rights owners have caught the D2C bug and are pursuing that particular model very strongly, F1 TV being a fantastic example. When thinking about competing over the next few years, you don't just have to think about competing with the likes of Netflix and YouTube, who have made your life a nightmare over the last 10, but also a host of new supersized entities who have huge amounts to spend on content, extremely long investment horizons, and most of this type of company, they're usually quite willing to open up in a country and operate a video platform at a 0 to negative margin while they build market share. It makes things even more difficult unless you're Netflix or AT&T or whoever. And finally, I think in a few years' time, the world of entertainment will largely coalesce around 4 to 6 gigantic supersized video platforms. I think we know what 3 to 4 of those platforms may be, and I think it's the supersizers over the next few years who will fight for the last couple of slots. And at that point, we should see an extremely different entertainment industry to that which we've been used to. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm still confident that we can say TV's best days lie ahead. Oh.